it has been reported already that 73 people in Gaza have been killed since the so-called ceasefire deal was announced. Ceasefire deal that demands Benjamin Netanyahu get the agreement of cabinet members who are clearly committed to the occupation of the Gaza Strip. One of them already, at least one of them, the defense minister no less, already lives in an occupied territory adjudged to be illegal. And I don't know why I'm saying adjudged. One of them already lives in an illegally occupied territory. So he's got people in his cabinet who dream of doing the same to Gaza. They've been increasingly open and bold about saying so publicly. So the difficulties of getting a ceasefire deal past them remain pretty big. And there it is, really. Another thing I thought about yesterday, and this might be a stupid question, but have you ever heard an interview with the parents, the mother of one of the children being held, often without charge, in Israeli jails? Sometimes it's the finer detail of what you read that jars the most, more perhaps than the headlines. So there'll be a lot of children released under this deal if it ever comes to fruition. I've never heard an interview with the mother of a child held without charge in Israeli jail. I've never really seen it reported on what kind of thing you might get locked up for without trial as a child in Israel. But there we are. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. I find myself looking... I'll tell you what it was. There was a line yesterday. I forget where it was. There was a line yesterday that we were reading. I read it to you, and I paused. I stumbled over it because I thought it's unintentionally inaccurate. It talked about Palestinian people in Northern Gaza, parts of Northern Gaza, will be able to return to their homes. And I thought, well, no, they won't, will they? Because the footage that comes out of the strip, the footage that we can actually see, looks almost like a sort of moonscape. It looks almost like apocalyptic. It looks like there is nothing there. It looks like something out of Star Wars, except that they're happening now and in real life. Some of the pictures, I mean, there are obviously still buildings there. There are even, I think, one or two hospitals left. But what do people return to? Tent encampments have become commonplace. The idea, another line I think I should throw into the mix at this point. Antony Blinken, the outgoing US Secretary of State, and Joe Biden's administration, I don't think anybody could accuse of having made life difficult for the current Israeli administration. So Antony Blinken, the outgoing US Secretary of State, says Hamas has been able to recruit almost as many new fighters as Israel has killed during its ferocious offensive on the Gaza Strip. How many times have we sat here since October the 7th of 2023? How many times have we sat here since that atrocious, that terrorist atrocity undertaken by Hamas, and said that this response is going to make things worse? Historically, there's no earthly way you could destroy my home and not earn my eternal enmity. There's no earthly way you could kill my mum or kill my baby brother and not have an enemy for life. Such an odd logic that many supporters of, or unquestioning supporters of, the Israeli tactics deployed. We're going to eradicate Hamas. I don't think you are, mate, for the most obvious and simple of reasons, now confirmed in black and white by the outgoing US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. As the ceasefire teeters on the brink of completion, he has pointed out that Hamas have been able to recruit almost as many new fighters as Israel have managed to kill. The fighters contained within that 40,000 plus death toll. I sort of wonder who thought that would ever be an acceptable figure. But anyway, so what we are looking at is the question of what these Palestinian people, the ones lucky enough not to have been killed by Israel, what will they be returning to? When I read in the newspapers, when I read on the BBC that under the terms of the ceasefire deal, Palestinians will be able to return. What will they be returning to? I don't know. 10 minutes after 10 is the time. I don't know what they will be returning to. I would ordinarily rely upon international journalists. Well, no, that's not really true. Ordinarily, I'd rely on British journalists posted in the Gaza Strip, but there aren't any. Israel won't let them in. So what do we rely on? Who do you go to for your information? Al Jazeera have done some decent work on the ground. Some freelance journalists have. I forget the figure. Forgive me for this, because I should know. It should be burnt into my retina. I forget the precise figure of the number of journalists who've been killed by the IDF. It's staggering. I think if you compare it to other military engagements, if you compare it to other wars, it's an almost unique figure, proportionately speaking. But what do they get? What do these people return to? And I don't want to make light of, well, I don't think it would be possible for anyone to make light of any of this. But, when we talk about the consequences of flooding, I'm looking at the fires in Los Angeles, and my thought turns to the aftermath. My thoughts turn to what actually happens. You find yourself thinking, because it's just about manageable and feasible that this could happen to you. But maybe not wildfires if you live in this country, because it's always bloody raining. But certainly floods, and you sort of find yourself thinking, when you see people being flooded, you find yourself thinking, what actually happens? Where do you go? How many people have to sleep in the building that's sort of knee-deep in muddy water downstairs? And we have had some incredible phone-ins. I think between 200 and 220 journalists now known to have been killed by the IDF. So that's another reason why it's very hard to know who you can ask the question. What are Palestinian people returning to? But I'm a bit different from proper journalists, if you like, because I can always ask you. And we know, don't we, that there's always people listening to this program who are incredibly well qualified to comment on every question I've ever asked. I don't want to jinx anything. I don't want to say every question I could ever ask, but you've never let me down yet, and I know you won't let me down today. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. I don't know what they return to, but I do know that if it was a natural disaster, we'd have asked this question a little bit sooner. We did it, last month, was it? Talking about floods. I was hearing about all the American insurance companies that now won't insure homes in Los Angeles. And immediately my thoughts go to, what if that was me? What if your home burnt down and no one had insured it? That's like a wipeout on a scale that's almost impossible to contemplate, isn't it? So when I read that the ceasefire is, please God, imminent, a little bit celebratory, some of the headlines this morning. I think, having spoken to Noga Tarnopolsky in Jerusalem yesterday about Netanyahu's challenges from within his own cabinet, I didn't join in with the celebratory tone of some of the headlines, but always optimistic. You always have to be optimistic, don't you? But I did find myself thinking, on that one line, Palestinian people will be able to return. What will they be returning to? Hit the numbers now, and you will get through. What will they be returning to? Connor tells me, and I haven't double-checked this, that for context, a total of 69 journalists were killed in World War II and 63 in the Vietnam War. So I don't know what propaganda is being put out there to persuade people that killing journalists is absolutely fine, but you know that there will be some, which you can only do because there are no other journalists in there to tell you whether it's true or not. So I want to know what Palestinian people, displaced in their hundreds of thousands, living in tents now, in some cases for the best part of a year, told to move to one space because it would be safe, and then enduring attacks upon that space that they'd been told would be safe, so moving to another space. Hospitals coming under repeated and sustained attack, all infrastructure in some parts of the Gaza Strip being destroyed. What happens next? And I don't mean this geopolitically or militarily, okay? I think the obvious consequences of this war by Israel being the biggest recruiting campaign that Hamas could ever have imagined is going to be recorded by the history books as inarguable, as irrefutable. Those of us who've sat here with concern for everybody in that blighted part of the planet in the forefronts of our mind, a refusal from the very start to feel sadder about the death of a Palestinian than about the death of an Israeli, to feel angrier about the killing of a Muslim than about the killing of a Jew. A very rare perspective to be taken in the UK media, but we've managed to take it. And you look at what is going to happen next militarily, or what is going to happen next geopolitically, and you sort of think probably just rinse and repeat. So we're not going into that. We're going only into what the human reality will be for people who will be, quotes, allowed to go back home. Go back to what? Precisely. Go back to what exactly? How does this bit work? I don't know if you work in the field or if you've experienced similar, or if you have family. Maybe that'd be great. Maybe you can pick up the radio station in the actual Gaza Strip somehow. But what do you even begin to do when you're dealing with something like this? You are rebuilding everything. I remember, obviously I'm far too young to have been around in the Second World War, but when I was a kid in the 70s, sometimes big car parks would be bomb sites. The reason why there were big spaces in the middle of cities was because bombs had dropped there. But as far as I can tell in the Gaza Strip, it would be the opposite. There might be the occasional building standing up in the middle of a massive bomb site. What does it even mean? What does it even mean to say that these people can no go back? Go back to what? 0345 6060 973. Isn't the word home? Isn't a word home an incredible syllable? Home. They're allowed to go back home, and it does mean something. That's why people are celebrating. Allowed to go back home. But when you start digging into what that actually means physically, as opposed to emotionally, you are left in a state of almost complete confusion and or ignorance. I won't be doing much. I think Idiot's Corner is far too mild a phrase to use, but I'll read one because I want you to know what I deal with on a day like today. James, and this is from Sharon, who has signed this message Lucy for some reason, but her WhatsApp tells me her name is Sharon. Heaven forbid you should mention the October the 7th atrocities on thousands of innocent Israelis. So listen to the same thing you listened to. Heard me mention it, but thought she'd send a message claiming that I hadn't. But why so frightened of the question of what Palestinians will be returning to, Lucy stroke Sharon? Why? Why so desperate that nobody actually asks that question? Why so committed to the idea that you'd be able to silence a simple humanitarian question with lies and propaganda? Is it because it's always worked in the past? I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, but it won't work here. It won't work here. Never. What are these Palestinian people going back to?